you see, the Lord doesn't create poverty. We do. We create poverty with the structures that we put in place that either permit people an opportunity to fulfill their potential, or we cap their capacity, with laws, with schooling and opportunities for education, with food and all of that. And so if you cut all of that out, what you're doing is creating a permanent underclass. We've fought too hard and too long to get to where we are, to let some few people take us back to where they want to go. Because for them, it may have been the good old days, but they were the bad old days for the bulk of America. The Department of Education will also determine qualifications for teaching. And we'll have a bureaucracy that will determine who's qualified to teach, who isn't, who they let in, who they put out. So it's a mechanism for control. The whole Project 2025 is about control and domination, and creating what you want, and having people conform to it, or they're breaking the law. And don't you find it fascinating? It was Jimmy Carter, who created the Department of Education and made it a governmental agency. And they've been fighting ever since to dismantle that.
Project 2025 called for the elimination of Head Start. And as you know, or may not know, there are 833,000 low-income children receiving Head Start. It provides major help to low-income families, and just like to discuss what the impact would that have on our society if we cut out Head Start.
It's interesting that they would target on Head Start, which involves a lot of the preschool programs that were designed to help, marginalized communities in terms of learning, reading and the basic, preschool academic skills. And right now, there has been an increase in federal funds going to schools to give children and what's called an early start. Right now, in many of the schools, the public schools have taken on the preschool, entity, whereas in the past, it was more so private or, religious schools that actually had the preschool population. So a lot of funding is right now allocated because research is showing that children, give them that Head Start, give them that preschool education, that they will increase their overall educational and academic performance. So if that is just done away with, many of our children, again, will be further set back in terms of the educational support that they receive.
When I was in high school, they had already done something in terms of preparing all of the persons in Black schools for going into the service. While they had ROTC in the white schools, they came up with what they called NDCC for the Black schools. It was called National Defense Cadet Corps. Needless to say, we knew exactly what it was. It was in our Defense Corps. Why? Because we're the only ones who had it, because everybody else got ROTC. They wouldn't even give us ROTC. They named it differently so you would know what schools it went to. And they prepared you. You had to dress up in military garb. They furnished that for you. You had to go to military classes. They made you do that. You had to pass those classes. And then they built a rifle range on the back of our parking lots. So you would go out there and learn how to shoot the current rifles. You had to learn how to break them down, put them together, how to clean them and all of that, and how to fire them. And so a lot of the persons right after high school, when they finished the NDCC program, they got drafted. Those who didn't get drafted were either going to college and they were going to defer your draft going into the military. So this is nothing new that has not already been tried before and failed because of the bureaucratic structures that have been put in place to circumvent it. So now we realize what we need to do is dismantle those bureaucratic structures or either take them over so we can accomplish what we want to do to create the kind of society we want to see.
And I'm going to take a little bit more linear view than Pastor did. And the origins of this go back to the Brown decision. When the court in 1954 ruled 9-0 that it was permissible for the federal courts to order the desegregation of public schools in the United States. The right, and particularly Southern whites, have been on the rampage. And so, with this most recent decision, 70 years later, basically they've rendered the notion that we don't want African Americans or Latinos or whoever to have the same kind of access to public education that we do. Clearly, Bakke was a half a loaf in terms of affirmative action when they said, you can take race into consideration, but it can't be the only factor. What the courts have said now, both in terms of not only just education, but employment, is that institutions can effectively kind of bypass kind of thinking about race as a positive factor in the admission of students. And by default, that also means income. If you tried to say, okay, we're going to eliminate race, but we're going to kind of make decisions predicated upon levels of education, I think that these folk would still argue that we really don't want poor folks in schools as well. So, that's my take, is that this is just sweet revenge for Southern racists. And so after 70 years, they basically gotten what they wanted, which is not having to kind of be responsible or be a party to having education that's available to everyone. Let's go back to 1980 when, as Gil Scott-Heron said, Ronald Reagan announced he was running for president. So where did he make his announcement? Okay, anybody have any ideas where he made his announcement? At Bob Jones University in South Carolina. Okay, and does anybody know who Bob Jones was and what he represented? Okay, Bob Jones was to American Protestantism in the South what George Curley Wallace was to politics in the South. Okay, didn't want to have anything to do with folks like us. And Bob Jones University is one of these denominational schools in which vouchers, the whole notion of vouchers and kind of getting the government out of your business, and the notion that public funds would be taken for your voluntary choice to send your child to an independent school. It's just kind of a furtherance of this notion of segregation. They want to take public funds away from public education and give them to private enterprises. What I would call elite independent schools don't want government money. Okay, if you had a child and they were kind of interested in sending them to a private school on the West Side, you might look at the Center for Early Childhood Education. This is probably the best K-8, elementary school in LA. They don't want public money, okay? It's full freight. If you were looking to send your kid to a high school, you would say, well, I'd like my kid to go to Harvard Westlake because of its academics and athletic excellence. they don't want private money. I mean, they don't want public money because they are fully funded. They have Harvard Westlake has an endowment that would be the envy of a small liberal arts college. Okay. They have a donor base that would be the equivalent of a small liberal arts college. But it's the new evangelical Protestant conservative wing that really want to take government funds and take them away from government and take them away from public institutions which would educate African Americans, Latinos, students with disabilities, and kind of give it to only places where you would have a copy of the Ten Commandments on the bulletin board, and that would be the governing principles for the school. So this is something that's not new. This is something that's, as I said, began with the Brown decision, and then when Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for the presidency, that he did it at Bob Jones University, kind of set the Republican Party in place, that they are the party of the old 11 states, the Confederacy. It would be devastating to low-income communities. Let's not even look at Los Angeles. It'd be devastating for Los Angeles. Los Angeles Unified, I think, is about 80% non-white. But let's take a city like Jackson, Mississippi, okay, in which whites have basically abandoned the city and they've abandoned public education, okay? That would just wipe out public education in the Mississippi state capital. Or we can look at Baton Rouge, okay? And, in East Baton Rouge Parish, okay, which you're familiar with, just look when you go to visit, family or go back to Southern, look at the proliferation of independent schools.
Impact that it would have on secondary schools or the K-12 program, the Head Start program, and you look at it, like, as Pastor said earlier, what it does to families of poverty, and how it impacts jobs for many people who work, and many minorities. That's really what I'm talking about. So I think your question was, what's the impact? I mean, there are tremendous impacts, both economic impacts as well as, if you will, cultural impacts and other ways. So vouchers are good in a sense. There was a time in my life when I thought, oh no, let's not do vouchers because it will, just totally wipe out the public school system. But things have changed, and I have changed my view on that. However, not because I'm thinking about some of the charter schools. Not all charter schools are bad, nor are all of them good. The same is true of public schools. So with 2025, I'm sure, well, I'm not sure because I have not read 900 pages, as Pastor said, but I just doubt very seriously that it's crafted in such a way that's going to be advantageous to children and people of color. Think about your preschool programs in places like Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, that's what they have for preschool. And I don't know that vouchers will make a difference. I don't know. So as an educator, I'm real concerned about 2025.
Yes, I was just going to comment on just affirmative action. Just in my lifetime, I've seen the impact of the dismantling of affirmative action across our college campuses, universities, in the workforce. And whenever those programs, and for example, I originally from Michigan and went to University of Michigan, where affirmative action, was in place. And I've said this before, that when I went through University of Michigan, the goal, even at that time, was 10% to increase minority presence on the campus by 10%. They never made the 10%, but when I was there, it was the highest ever, which was 7%. And since then, right now, there may be 3 or 4% minority, particularly African-American presence on the college campus. And so we think about the affirmative action programs that were in place in the 70s, early 80s, and even here in California. I just couldn't believe when affirmative action was on the ballot and it failed, and the research has shown that every time affirmative action fails, there's a decline in Black and minority presence on college campuses. And again, not only in college campuses, but also in the workforce.
And we need to look at terms that are used and put on programs that help the least who need it. And notice how that's done, because it seems as though I got to give you something that you didn't earn, and that's not so. White schools have affirmative action. They don't call it that. They call it legacy. Notice, when they do what they do, they label it so that it's positive and it seems to be more equitable, when in reality, it is not. Legacy, that's what they say. And so affirmative action was nothing more than the little and common man's legacy in order to be able to pull himself up by bootstraps, because one, you took away his bootstraps, and what you were going to do was give him some bootstraps now so he could say he could pull himself up by his bootstraps. And those who were products of affirmative action pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and have made significant contributions, to our country and to our world. So we need to always be extremely careful about legislation and how it is labeled. Maybe that was all they could do to get it through at that time, but notice what they have done. They use those kinds of labels so that later on they can come and say, well, we did what we're supposed to do. We Christian, we had more than they did, and what we did was provide an opportunity for them to catch up with us. And how long do we have to continue to do that? You see, it is unchristian, I know, when you don't want to help the last, the least, and the lost. That is basic and foundational among any faith, that you are to be compassionate for everybody, but particularly because there are certain folk who need it more than other folk. I don't think we ought to be duped in believing that we live in a colorblind society because of all of the accomplishments that so many of African Americans have made since civil rights, and particularly, having the first Black president.
Pastor, I want to take it a step farther, and that is, think about the origin stories. Okay, whether we go back and we think about the origin story with Moses, think about the origin story of the United States. It's these wonderful, virtuous men who didn't want to pay a tea tax, right? And they fought for their independence. And so let's kind of move from 1776 to 1787. Okay, Philadelphia, okay, of all places. Group of Black folks worshiped at St. George's Church, okay? And were initially welcomed and sat on the first floor. One Sunday they walked in and the usher said, no, you can't sit on the first floor. You got to go and sit in the balcony. Okay, who were these people? Well, the two most famous, of course, are Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Okay, so they went out and they formed the Free Africa Society, which was a benevolent society that existed from 1787 to 1816. Absalom Jones went out and was confirmed as an Episcopal priest and opened St. Thomas's Church in 1794. Richard Allen was the first bishop of the AME Church and the AME Connection, which exists to this day. Okay, what was also going on in 1787 in Philadelphia? Well, funny you should ask, to paraphrase Pastor. 55 men were sitting down and they wrote a document that turned out to be what? The Constitution of the United States. So why can't we tell both of those origin stories? Okay, here is Philadelphia, 1787. Okay, here's a story about a country kind of codifying itself and becoming independent. And also, here's a country in 1787 and a religious community saying, guess what? We don't want Black folks in our parish on Sunday morning. Okay, so it's all of this is about the origin stories. Okay, we belong as much as they belong, and they don't know our story. So when we tell our story, they're shocked. Okay, a classic example. Second Baptist is 139 years old. Yes, Second Baptist is 139 years old. It's the second oldest African-American congregation in the city of Los Angeles. Well, I didn't know that. Well, why didn't you know that? Okay, because you didn't pay attention to Black folk. Okay, and that's the case that we're dealing with now. They don't want to hear our origin stories. They don't want to hear the origin stories about Los Angeles. And again, 1787. Okay, when 66 people found their way here, half of them were mestizos. They were Mexican and of African descent. Do you ever hear that story told? No, that's not an origin story that people want to hear.
We live in a technological society where you can Google and get information at the snap of a finger. So that's why I say, Google it and pull it up, and you can look at it from any angle you want. Mm-hmm. And I think you will see it promotes racism, sexism, misogyny, and if you can't get it that way, then look at a news station, look at a variety of different news stations, and see how silos have been created with people who just listen to what they listen to without evaluating it over against that which would be opposed to it. And so I do know for Christians, you can always make them aware of the fact that the Bible says, "Where much is given, much is required." So do you think you're fulfilling giving as much back as the Lord has given to you? And I do know another thing. The Bible makes it unequivocally clear, particularly through the teachings of Jesus, that you cannot and you should not advantage yourself by disadvantaging others.